Hi guys! So I chose to do my critical reflection on socioeconomically distributed education as a commodity, or perhaps you could call it the great disparity in our country between rural or suburban school systems, more so suburban, versus the urban education system. And that excludes, of course, private schools. We're just talking about public schools here. But I'd say that there is an undeniable disparity at play in the education system. I've seen it in my student teaching and substitute work, and I have a good friend who works in the Rochester City School District, and I've spoken with him several times about what it's like to work in that setting. And I think that it can be really disheartening because we want to believe that there is equality, but there's not. I spent a few months in a middle school in the city of Newburgh in the Hudson Valley, and when you pull up to the neighborhood, the soundtrack there is comprised of breaking glass and high-pitched screaming, and the decor of the buildings is bullet hole chic. So many of these young kids are coming to school having stayed up all night and missed a morning meal. And no matter what the curriculum is that you've prepared for them that day, they're beginning at a disadvantage. And so why then would we dump upon them the very least of our resources rather than pouring upon them the most and the best? Could it be that a democratic education would be at the core of repairing the absence of a universal approach to informing, guiding, and mentoring the young people who will one day grow to be the populace of our nation? One book that really stood out for me, it was the inspiration for the entirety of my research, was Jonathan Kozol's Savage Inequalities. If you haven't read it, it's a really great book. He's a very strong writer, and everything that he says really speaks to the reader in a way that humanizes these theories of education and makes it super personal. He was going around all over the country to different public schools and documenting what he saw. And it can be really depressing stuff, but it's very important. He says, children hear and understand this theme, that they're poor investments and they behave accordingly. If society's resources would be wasted on their destinies, perhaps their own determination would be wasted too. So rather than ignoring those who suffer and writing them off as less than, could we not redirect our motivations such that we appreciate the value of pooling our resources and our efforts in a way that actually serves all children, or at least aims to do so? Another book that you can find in the SUNY Brockport Library is called Schools Betrayed, also a very good read. This one's by Catherine Neckerman. She goes around all different settings, and she also looks at different major cities just like Kozol did. And she sort of gives you a really historical background to what it is that caused the disparities in education. And she looks at the effect it has on the labor force and what it is that segregation really means in the United States now and before and in our future. And, she really highlights a need to assemble an actual union with a specific strategic plan in place which will set out to actually incite progress within the system itself. She says, if we are serious about promoting the well-being of the most vulnerable children in our society, we will build a national coalition for measures that revitalize inner city neighborhoods and support low-income urban families. So Another very great book, which is in the SUNY Brockport Library, is called Battling Corruption in America's Public Schools by Lydia Segal. Segal outlines the ways that corruption can be seen in the data that we have with regards to where the money actually goes that's supposedly going into the schools and towards our students, and what we've tried to do in the past and what we've been trying to do in the present to actually combat this corruption. And she looks towards other countries, specifically Canada, and shows us what they do that works and what we really ought to be looking towards as a model for what we should be doing. The current system that's in place is rife with corruption, deceit, and misinformation, and it serves to influence our youth such that they actually aspire to positions of power in which they too may practice the indecencies that they see within their school system. We're supposed to be setting the bar and showing children what to strive towards, and in fact, we're just doing them such a disservice when we ourselves are setting a very poor example, which ultimately breeds further corruption, and that's the opposite of what we ought to be hoping for, aspiring towards, and enacting. She says there's something inherently antithetical between the goal of public schools, which is to teach students to be fully participating citizens in a democracy, and at the same time accepting that schools lie and cheat to accomplish this mission. So like I said, I have some experience seeing the different ways that the system is flawed, seeing the ways that students in suburban settings receive so much by way of resources, teachers who are dedicated and paid well. They're already coming to school with the basic necessities to succeed. And I've also worked in places where none of that was there, none of it was present, and it's really just so obviously a disservice that we're doing to our nation's youth. Dan Rather, in 2009, spent an entire year in Detroit. He highlighted the ways that this city with a 50% unemployment rate, where half of all the city's schools have been closed down, he showed us that this is a city which is really struggling, and the schools are just both a product of that struggle and they are a catalyst for further struggle. Arnie Duncan is in his documentary, which was shown by ABC in 2009. He was the Secretary of Education, and when he went to Detroit, he called it the ground zero of education, an educational disgrace. And in Dan Rather's very informative, very personal, beautifully done, well-crafted documentary, he tells us that Detroit, it was the motor city. At one point, it was the fourth largest, most striving city of all. But we saw in 1965, the white flight to the suburbs took place, and rioting, looting, and an actual declaration of a state of emergency was enacted. And in 1970, desegregation attempts were made by way of busing students from the suburbs into the schools of Detroit. And those very school buses that were being used for desegregation purposes were torched, lit on fire in a very violent uprising against desegregation. So in 1974, the Supreme Court actually ruled that busing for the purpose of desegregation would be banned. This was under Milliken versus Bradley, and it was a disgusting show of a lack of desire from the top level of the government of the United States. They just did not have that desire, that compassion, that empathy to enact desegregation in our schools. And Dan Rather said, we must do a far better job of educating our youth if we want to be competitive in the world's economy, if we want to make sure our children and our children's children continue to enjoy a standard of living which we have come to take for granted. And I think that really sums it up best. It's not just that we are doing a disservice to the people of this country who don't have the means to rise up against that disservice. We are actually really damaging our nation by doing this disservice to the nation's youth. And it isn't right, and we can change it. And what it takes is a public awareness and a public desire for change.